Under Wildwood, Chapter 5. Enter the Assassin. A braided barista excused herself while she stretched her arm over Miss Thennis's head and pulled the cord to the neon open sign in the cafe's front window. It flickered a few times before turning off, and Prue looked up at the girl apologetically. "Sorry," she said. "We'll get out of your hair now." The barista smiled and waved her hand. "Nah," she said. "Don't worry about it. Looks like you two are having a serious conversation. I got a ton of cleanup to do anyway. Take your time." Out on the dark avenue, a red traffic light changed green, and the shine of passing headlamps flashed the front window. The last of the fading, dim light was rapidly disappearing behind the wall of trees just beyond the river's ravine. Prue glanced up at the clock on the wall above the cafe bar. It was 5:30. "Shoot," said Prue. "I should really get going." Miss Thennis was sitting beneath the taxidermied head of a moose. Prue hadn't noticed it until that moment. "Yeah," said Miss Thennis, dazed. "Yeah." She hadn't touched her cappuccino. The milk foam had begun to look like Christmas tree flocking. Prue waited for her teacher to say something else, but nothing was coming. "I'm sorry to, burden you with all this. I know it sounds so crazy." "Yeah," repeated the teacher. She shook her head a little and rubbed her chin with a finger. A bracelet made of small wooden beads clattered against her wrist. "So, again, Curtis, your friend, the one who went missing, he's still there." "Yeah," said Prue, "with a band of bandits." "Yeah, I mean, he's a bandit himself now." "Uh-huh," replied Miss Thennis. "Right. What about his parents?" "They don't know." Miss Thennis seemed to blanch. "Okay." You swore yourself to secrecy, Miss Thennis," Prue reminded the teacher. Darla squirmed in her chair. "Yeah, well, I didn't know your story would involve a missing child." A pause. "So Curtis is just there? In the bandit camp?" "Yep, totally safe. I'd even go so far as to say that he's probably totally happy there." "And where is this place? Where's the camp?" "Doesn't matter," Prue said, scraping a fingernail at the little of the foamed milk residue on the edge of her mug. "Like I said, you wouldn't be able to go in there anyway." "Right. Magical barrier." "Mm-hmm." "But he's safe?" Miss Thennis leaned forward in her chair. "And this so-called bandit king, this Brendan, is he in the hideout too?" "Yeah, that's his home." "Well, I can tell you I'm going to definitely have to let this all, settle for a bit in my mind." She sat back in her chair and wiped her hands on her gauzy, floral-patterned skirt. The room's quiet was disturbed only by the occasional clacking of the barista and her juggled fleet of pitchers and mugs. "Sure," said Prue. "Listen, I know it's a lot to take in, but I can't tell you how nice it is to have someone other than my parents to confide this stuff to. It's been driving me crazy." Darla allowed herself a smile. "No problem. But you have to get going, right? Walk you home?" "Yeah, thanks." They walked in silence down the wet sidewalks, their shoulders hunched against the cold. The torrent of words and emotions that had positively poured out of Prue at the coffee shop haunted her. Like an overly rich dessert you'd devour without a thought, then the regret kicking in only once the last spoonful had been consumed. Prue was now wondering if confessing her wild adventure in the impassable wilderness had really been the best idea. Without turning her head, she glanced sideways at Darla, who was walking, lost in her own thoughts, and inwardly cringed. What was going to happen now? Would Darla respect Prue's wishes to keep this revelation to herself? Would she tell the police? Or Curtis's parents? Her nose stung at the frigid wind, and she pulled her scarf higher against her cheeks. Maybe that was for the best, after all. Maybe Prue had been the one at fault here, not telling the Melbergs and letting them despair over the loss of their son. Curtis. What had Prue brought on him? What kind of wild life among bandits would he be leading? Would they be sufficient parents for a kid? Was Brendan really the right father figure for a boy to... Suddenly, something occurred to Prue. It revealed itself to her like the answer to a puzzle you'd contemplated for hours without seeing the easiest solution. And it made her spine go cold. "Hey," she said. "Darla." "Yeah?" "When we were talking back in there, in the cafe, you said his name." "Whose name?" "Brendan's. The Bandit King." "Uh-huh. Isn't that his name?" Prue dug her hands deeper into her peacoat pockets. "Yeah, but..." "But what?" "I don't remember telling you his name before." Quiet. A car passed. The muffled sound of a syncopated bass track reverberated from within. "You must have," said Darla Thennis. "I don't think I did." Darla laughed a little. "Oh, Prue, you've been through a lot. You're just confused. It's totally understandable. Here, isn't this your house?" The familiar front porch loomed on the sidewalk ahead. "Yeah," said Prue. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I just need to chill out or something." She looked into Darla's eyes, black and empty in the street lampless dark, and reached out her hand. "Thanks," she said. "Thanks for listening." Darla, grasping with both hands, holding tightly, saying, "Of course. See you tomorrow." Pulling from the handshake, Prue mounted the steps to her front door. Light from the living room descended from the house onto the yard, and a weave of leftover Christmas lights winked on the steps banister. Prue felt unsettled as she climbed, reaching the front door. She paused at the handle and turned. Miss Thennis was still standing on the sidewalk, her face obscured in the blank dark. The figure waved. Prue waved back and walked into her house. Whatever uneasiness she was feeling disappeared immediately as she stepped into the foyer of her family's home. Instead, she was overcome by a scent so pungent and all-consuming that it seemed to dispel all other thoughts from her mind. Pickles. She crinkled her nose and shouted, "What is that?" Her dad appeared from the kitchen wearing long rubber gloves and holding what appeared to be a mossy clump of greenishness. "Oh, hi, honey," he said. He quickly slipped back into the kitchen. Prue shed her peacoat, kicked off her wellies, and followed her dad. "What's that smell?" she asked. In the kitchen, her mother and father were staring at a large brown crock in the middle of the cork floor. "Pickles," her mother explained. "Forgotten pickles." Her dad smiled sheepishly. "Remember those cukes we got at the farmer's market at the end of September? Kind of forgot about them. Now they're either the best pickles known to man or totally poisonous." He held aloft the weird green mass in his gloved hand. "Want to try?" "Blech," said Prue. "When can we fumigate?" "Immediately," said her mother, grasping the crock and pouring the remnants into the disposal unit in the sink. Her father acted downcast. "Goodbye, magic pickles," he said mournfully. "Let me help." Reaching under the sink for the spritzer of lemon water, she began spraying it about the room. "How was your walk?" asked her dad as he peeled the rubber gloves from his hands. "Good," she said. "Fine. Weird." "Why weird?" This was her mother, wiping the counter clean of some of the pickles uh, wiping the counter clean of some of the pickle croc's brackish liquid. I ran into Miss Thennis. Darla. Really? That's funny. She left just after you did. She said she had to head back to school. The bluff would not be on the way back to school. This was odd. Yeah, I ran into her and she bought me a steamed milk at the coffee shop, said Prue. She didn't mention that she'd passed out. That seemed like too much to reveal. And it would require mentioning the screams from the Scotch broom, which would be downright weird. She seems to be a very cool teacher, said her mother. Is she new this semester? Yeah, replied Prue, staring fixedly at the lumpy pickle her dad had left on the counter. From Eugene, I guess. Well, that explains it, said her mother. So whatever happened to Mrs. Estevez? Her father asked. Dunno, retired, health reasons. Someone said we all drove her crazy. Her dad made a face. Ooh. Prue swiveled and began walking upstairs. Anyway, I'll be in my room. Let me know when dinner is. Soon, hollered her mother up after her. It's lentil curry, your favorite. Her father couldn't help but interject, and don't think we haven't forgotten about the note from school. Pause. Because we haven't. Prue closed her bedroom door behind her and found herself blessedly alone. The patterned rug on the floor, littered with the contents of an overturned laundry hamper, was only barely made visible by the yellow light from the terrarium on her desk. Following the glow, she leaned over and tapped on the glass. Her box turtle, Edmund, moved inside, the half-chewed remains of a leaf balanced on his small head. She reached over and turned on the swivel lamp and assessed the few textbooks strewn about the desk's surface. She half-heartedly grabbed the slim paperback at the top of the pile and flipped it open to its dog-eared page. She read for a moment, trying to worm her way into the world of Atticus and Scout Finch, but find over a time that she was merely reading the same paragraph over and over. Defeated, she set down the book and launched herself into the folds of her bed. Lying on her back, she stared at the strange shadows cast on the ceiling by the neighbors' house lights through the bared branches of the trees in the yard. The wind had picked up, and the branches appeared to be long, spidery fingers lashing at one another. As she watched, a large blot darted over the display, blackening the windows completely for a split second. What was that? Prue mouthed. She hopped from her bed and ran to the window. She arrived just in time to see something dark disappear into the neighbor's juniper hedges. She pressed her forehead to the window, studying the ground below. The glass was icy cold against her skin. Her mother called from downstairs. Prue? Came the voice. She turned away from the window and stuck her head out of her door. What? I screwed up the naan bread, her mom called, sounding defeated. Could you run down to the takeout place and just pick some up? Still absorbed with the thought of the dark shape in the backyard, Prue marched down the stairs. In the kitchen, her mother was studying the back of a packet of instant yeast. Did you call it in? Asked Prue as she dipped her feet back into her Wellington boots. Yeah, said her mother. Here's $10. Grab some chutney while you're at it. I don't know why we didn't just order it all from there, murmured Prue, pocketing the cash. Hey, scolded her father, reading a magazine in the living room. Home-cooked meal, your mother's specialty. Mac was sitting on the floor at his feet, chewing on the frayed end of a chopstick. Pooh! He said. Be right back, Prue said, rolling her eyes. As she'd witnessed from her bedroom, the wind outside had picked up considerably. The temperature felt like it had plummeted several degrees, and Prue was back to experimenting with different, more efficient ways of wrapping her scarf around her neck. None of the options seemed to block out the chill satisfactorily. So she found herself just knotting the massive knitted thing at her chin and shoving her hands deep into her coat pockets. The Indian takeout place was 8 blocks away, but the distance felt unfathomable with the brittle wind and the frozen drizzle beginning to descend from the sky. Prue guessed it to be only 6:30, and yet the dark was everywhere. She eyed the underbrush warily as she walked, searching for movement. Pausing for a moment at an intersection, she focused her listening at a line of oaks to gauge their thoughts. The sound she heard was not unlike the noise made by a colony of bees if you were to catch them in a sympathetic mood and swimming in a large, thick puddle of mud. It came in lazy waves. For whatever reason, it inspired in her the necessary confidence to continue on her errand. But it occurred to her then, had the Scotch broom screaming been a warning? But a warning of what? The fox? A crack from above. Prue jerked her head upward. A tree bough, weighted with what little heavy snow remained, had broken from its trunk and fallen onto the branches below. The tree gave an audible groan. An electricity radiated through Prue's limbs from the surprise, though, and it took another half block of walking before she was able to shake it. A pitch darkness preceded her. The street lamps lining the few blocks between her and the restaurant, she could see the warm lit windows in the distance, appeared to not be working. Pausing momentarily, she took a deep breath and stepped into the veil of shadow. And that was when the trees started screaming. Shh! Prue's heart leapt. Instinctively, she began running in the direction of the restaurant. Something had crashed through the low bushes of the vacant lot and was now running after her. She could hear panting and frantic footsteps. The thing barked at her angrily, though she did not allow herself to look back to identify her pursuer. She kept her eyes on the safety of the restaurant's lit windows. The trees were still hollering at full throat, and their voices kettled in her mind like barely containable steam. The sound overpowered her thoughts, like it had at the bluff, and it was all Prue could do to maintain consciousness. The trees, if they were trying to safeguard her, were unaware of the power and presence of their voices. She flagged. She fell. The thing was on her in a flash. It pinned her to the sidewalk. It was a black fox, its fur matted from the cold precipitation in the air. Its muzzle snapped at her face. It smelled of moldering leaves. And patchouli. "Got you," hissed the black fox. The voice was feminine, familiar. "Ms." Prue wheezed, her breathing hampered by the weight of the animal on her chest. "Miss Thennis?" The thing smiled, if it could be said that a fox can smile. "Please," it said, its voice calm and insidious. "Call me Darla." The trees were still screaming. "Sorry to have to do this to you, kiddo," said the fox. "I'll try to make it painless." Prue squeezed her eyes shut. The moment seemed to last for an eternity. She waited for the teeth to sink in, the claws to bite. Just then there came a terrific gust of wind. The trees quieted, as if surprised. A yell from above. "Gah!" The weight was instantaneously lifted from Prue's chest, and her breath came roaring back. Glancing over, she saw that the black fox had been knocked across the sidewalk. Gasping, she scrambled to her feet while the fox desperately tried to right herself. "What was that?" cried the fox angrily. The words had scarcely left her snout, though, before another thing had descended from the sky and knocked her rolling out into the empty street. Prue, her hands on her chest, watched as 2 giant herons alighted on the sidewalk before her. "Prue!" shouted a boy's voice. It was Curtis, astride one of the large gray birds. Prue could not speak. "Watch it!" called another voice. Prue looked over to see that it was Brendan. He, too, was mounted on one of the herons. "She's coming back!" The fox had pushed herself up and was about to make a running leap at Prue. Stumbling backward, she threw her arms up to cover her face and felt the full weight of the fox come down on her shoulder, knocking her sideways. A row of ivory white teeth snapped noisily just inches from her ear. As she fell, however, she managed to get a foot under the fox's haunches and kicked hard. The fox yelped and tumbled away to the concrete. "Run, Prue!" This came from Curtis. Prue glanced up at him. He was clinging to his heron's neck as the bird launched itself aloft and dove toward the prostrate fox. Both of the bandits' mounts pounced on the back of the fox while it was briefly incapacitated. The fox howled in pain as their claws dug in. Her energies renewed, the fox spun and struck Brendan's flying mount hard across the beak. Prue pushed herself up and bolted down the darkened street. She could hear behind her the sound of the fox breaking away from the skirmish and giving chase. Brendan swore. A bird squawked. Prue felt the fox growing closer. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to survive another attack. She felt something sharp digging into the fabric of her pea coat and screamed, and then her feet began to lift from the ground. She looked up and saw that she was in the talons of one of the herons. The bird was straining under the weight, and its wings were moving in long, powerful beats. Prue could see Curtis's face just over the wing of the bird. The fox leapt and swiped at Prue, but only caught the hem of her pant leg. The heron let out a loud, mournful call, a kind of gravelly howl, and Prue found her feet touching back down on the pavement. "Come on, Maud!" shouted Curtis from the heron's back. Prue kept up the bird's frantic pace, the soles of her Wellington smacking the pavement like a runner on a treadmill gone wild. She could only hope that the heron would have enough thrust to get into the air again. She glanced behind her and saw that the fox was close in pursuit. Just as it was about to leap, the other bird, with Brendan astride, appeared from the darkness and struck the fox hard against its rump, and it tumbled sideways. Prue's feet once again left the ground, and the street below began to diminish. A brief tussle ensued between Brendan's mount and the fox, but on seeing Prue's escape, the bird gave the fox one final swipe across the snout and took to the sky. The fox howled, but the sound was soon lost as the two massive birds climbed above the treetops and disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. Prue finally managed to speak. Her hands clasped tightly to the heron's claws at her shoulder. "Where are you taking me?" She found she had to holler it above the whipping wind. Curtis's yelled response was, "To Wildwood!"